So yeah, thank you so much again, Maria, for speaking with us as part of this WICMA summer intern project. Groups of us have been sitting down with recently graduated Williams studio art majors to talk about their work, and we can't wait to hear all about your practice today. So to start, we thought we could just do quick introductions. I'm Zoe. I'm calling in from New Haven, Connecticut. And I'm about to start my second year in the graduate program in art history at Williams. Maybe Sia, you can go next.
I'm Thea. I'm calling in from New York, and I'm an undergrad history and studio major, rising junior. And Maria, to start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're calling in from?
Yeah, so my name is Maria. I am a 2020 graduate with a dual major in history and practice, so the art history and the studio degree, as well as chemistry. And I am calling in from New Orleans, which is where I have lived since I was 10, since 2017. No, 2007, so about 2 years after Katrina is when we moved down to New Orleans.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So to kick off things, it would be great if maybe you could describe a recent work to us and to the audience, and just tell us a little bit about how that connects to sort of like broader themes in your practice.
Yeah, so I think I started not really knowing about art. I didn't start I wasn't like the type of artist that like doodled when they were kids. I kind of fell into the art practice in college. So a lot of my recent work is in textiles. So I am specifically right now working on these embroideries on silk using red thread. And this is kind of an exploration about identity and kind of the sense of sometimes when you move far away from home. So I'm an immigrant. So I was born in Bolivia, moved to the States when I was 3. But there's been a lot of kind of like distancing, like a physical distance between my cultural heritage and like my family, to be quite honest, and then my life here in the United States, and kind of like navigating growing up in the South and navigating this really like knowing that I was Bolivian, but not really understanding what that meant. And so my art right now really tackles at this sense of indigeneity that by like my family and by like the little bit of stories that we still have is that I know that there is indigenous blood on my dad's side. But yeah, it wasn't something often spoken about in my household. And so I've kind of delved into Aymara and Quechuan textiles in the Altiplano of Bolivia in my thesis. And in doing so, I was kind of able to really tap into a cultural history of mine that I didn't know. And I wasn't learning at my house, and I had never seen it in the textbook. And so the silk really represents this like transparency of indigenous stories, right? It's like they're present, but I can't really fully grasp them. I can't really detail who they are. I don't have names. I don't speak Quechuan. I, grew up really, really far away. And I think it's like really interesting in that like my native language is Spanish, but Spanish is a colonial language, right? And like I'm Catholic, but Catholicism came to South America during colonization. And so all of these like really like interwoven and marred stories of violence and erasure. And then the red is actually something that my favorite color is red. And it stems from like various of things. But one of the biggest things that it stems from is because in Latin America, during the colonialization period, concholan plants, so this like vibrant red color that you find in like Las Meninas painting from Velázquez, and the little girl is holding these cups, they represent this like idea of globalization and power. But that red color came from indigenous bodies and indigenous communities here in South America. And so I use red in that way. It also, alludes to the body, to blood. It's a very like striking color. And it's always been one of my favorite colors. And so that's my current work, is really kind of diving more into like my understanding of my indigeneity now as a US citizen, as living in the United States, as identifying as an American, and really trying to understand this like multiplicity of an identity as as like an Indigenous person in like the 21st century. And like, how do you grapple with colonialism, colonial practices that continue in your family, right? Like the need to not want to talk about it or share or continue to document these important stories. And then also moving to a whole nother country and then living here and then navigating the American school system and then going to college. I joke with my mom that I like learned more about Bolivia on the floor of Sawyer than I did in my house. and it's like this very juxtaposing, very two different like lives that I live. And so that's my current work. I've also done other textile works with found objects. I've done work on immigration and kind of this bigger conversation about children immigrating. So I have a piece that's earlier that talks a lot about like, I am very privileged. I came to the United States with a green card and a permanent residency, but my mother lived undocumented for about 10 years here. And so I grew up in an environment where undocumentation and ICE and the violence and like the state sanctioned violence against immigrants here was something on like a daily, on a daily day. And so I wanted to really have a conversation about immigration, especially due to the El Paso shooting last year, as well as the Trump administration's separation of families at the border, and this, wider discussion of like the humanity behind what we see in the news or like the people that we see, and really trying to bring like a human aspect to it and make it like, I want people to be uncomfortable when they see things, because I think it makes you grapple with a very different. It's very easy to turn off your TV screen, right? And like ignore things. But when somebody kind of puts it in front of you, it makes you think about these children as being like possibly your children. I think it brings it a lot more. It collapses the distance between the viewer and this like story on the news, or these people that like you don't really know, and that you have this like fear of, which really, it's being disseminated by somebody else who is also not involved in that. And then my other work has, I've done drawing, printmaking, sculptures, oil painting, but I think right now my main medium is textiles. And so I think embroidery gives you, it's a very slow process. It's a very meticulous process. I go through many stages in the process. So I start off drawing everything out, the panels that I want to see. And I really draw a lot of references and a lot of inspiration from Aymara and Quechua textiles that I've kind of come across in my research, and this like very verticality of them. The ones that I make aren't meant to be worn, which is like a whole nother subsection of textiles. It's like the wearableness of a textile. Mine are really just meant to be hung. And they're very delicate. So it's a process to like get it drawn on and then sewn on. And so, yeah, that's kind of like what I've been working on is right now. And, I really love the materiality of it. Unlike other artworks, I feel like this is something it forces me to slow down and really think about every step that I'm taking, where every flower is going, or if like this is how I want it to look like, but also like rhythm and spacing. And so not the entire silk is covered in embroidery, but there are like moments where there's like panels is what I refer to them as. And then there are kind of spaces, like empty spaces, and then like something else will happen. Maybe it's smaller, maybe it's larger, maybe it's more complex, less complex. And the viewers can actually see themselves through the silk itself, because it's like an opaque white. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that like really intimate and personal history that has informed your work. Yeah, I think, talking about the sort of historical silencing of Indigenous histories in South America is a conversation that goes widely unspoken in South America, not to mention here in the States, and that sort of internalized racism that we see in our own ancestors and in our own family members sort of against their own Indigenous heritage is a really widespread problem in South America, and it is deeply connected to the colorism that we also continue to see in South America. So thank you so much for for delving into that for us. I'd love to talk a little bit more about your process. So you wrote that you began exploring embroidery relatively recently, which you just spoke a little bit about. So when you mentioned that your sort of artistic career really gained momentum in college. So what was the focus of your most earlier work, and how has your practice developed since then?
Yeah, so I think my early work, so my first art studio class was actually monotyping. So I am a printer initially, and I continue to love monotyping and printmaking. I think with my chemistry background, I really love something that like takes a long time. And I don't know why, but I enjoy having to like take it from one stage to the next stage to the next stage to the next stage to like a final product. And that's one of the reasons why like I really enjoyed printmaking. I really liked oil painting. I really liked sculpture. Like drawing was amazing, and it gave me tools that I needed to like perfect my art in other ways, but it wasn't like the medium that I like adored, right? I like prefer charcoal. Like I prefer things taking hours on end.
You like layers, it sounds like.
I do. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Everything about layers is like, it fascinates me. Like all my monotypes were layers on top of layers of different paints, of different mediums kind of blending together, and me forcing them to kind of work together. So when my artistic practice started, I thought I was going to be a doctor. Turns out I don't want to be a doctor, you know. Newsflash, Maria did not want to be a doctor. But I took monotyping because I stayed on campus instead of going abroad. And I was like, you know, like I really loved art. I'm dyslexic. I didn't know until I was in college. And art for me is a very visual medium, right? Art history came very naturally to me. I loved it in high school. I took one class in it. And then I was kind of like denying myself the love of art because I was afraid that I was going to be too good at art and not good enough at chemistry. I am, but that's fine. I like grew out of that like weird mental barrier that I had. And I took art history, and I took art history 102, and I credit it with opening a brand new door to like my academics at Williams. And so then the next semester I was like, you know, let's take the class, right? Let's take on the major. I'm going to be here anyways. And so you have to take one art studio class to get the art history major. Took monotyping. It had no drawing prerequisites. Told myself, you can't draw. So you can't, like, don't take drawing one. Like, drawing is not for you. You have to literally do the bare minimum just to get this credit. Little did I know that I was going to come across Professor Sen, who was brand new to Williams. And she took my world by storm. Right? Like next thing I knew, I was spending 10, 20 hours a week in the studio painting. And it started with kind of like very aesthetically pleasing things, right? Like I worked really, really hard to please her. And I worked really, really hard on like clean lines and a good technique, but none of my art really attacked anything. You know, it was just art for the abyss, as I like to call it, just art for art's sake. You know, it just existed for that deadline, for that grade, and then, you know, that was the end of it. Well, midway through my junior fall, my grandfather passed away. And I was kind of, he had been sick for many years, and I got the chance to go to Bolivia, actually. And so going back to Bolivia for these 5 crazy days in like the middle of the fall semester, I was able to almost recalibrate, right? Like I hadn't been home in 2 to 3 years. By then, my life was very radically, very different than when I went at the end of high school. When I went at the end of high school, one of my aunts took me on this like mini field trip in Bolivia. So I grew up in Santa Cruz, which is on the eastern side, closer to Brazil, but I had never traveled to the capital city, which is La Paz, which is in the mountains. And we also went to Cochabamba, which is another city. And so I was able to see a different side of Bolivia, a Bolivia that I really, truly loved. And it's gorgeous. I mean, if you ever have the chance to go to the Andes, I mean, it's just phenomenal. This city in the mountains, like no city in the United States can rival the beauty of one of those. And I, as an American, was like, oh, like no city is more pretty than like New York. False. It's just false. All of that is false. So I go back and I was surrounded by so much love, so much attention. I felt Williams is a very isolating place, especially in the wintertime. I came back, and I'm trying to finish my semester, and it's chaos. But I had my art studio final, and I had missed the final show because obviously I was behind on everything due to my grandfather's passing. And I didn't know what I wanted to make. I knew I wanted to make something that spoke about him, spoke about, something more personal, something more intimate that I was too afraid to ever truly address in my art, right? And I don't know why. I tried to do something, came out awful. And I remember being in the studio hours, and just things were just not very good. And I was very frustrated. And I made this print that I thought was the most hideous print. And Pallavi loved it. And obviously Pallavi was like, did you do this? And I was like, yeah, like I left it there because I was really, really upset with it. So I was actually just going to throw it away. And she was like, no, like this is great. And there were these like large globs of black ink. And behind the black ink were these mountains. And so I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I had thought about the mountains, its relationship to the indigenous people of Bolivia and the different communities that lived in the mountains, but also like the mountains present, like where I was living currently. And my grandfather always spoke about wanting to die. He lived his like older life here in the States, didn't like the United States. And he always spoke about wanting to die in Bolivia, wanting to die in his tierra, in his land. And a lot of those words kind of came back to me. We spent some time over the summer, and I created these prints they still exist. There's about 3 of them that I created, and it's mountains. It's really emblematic of, I drew direct inspiration from La Paz, and this like rugged mountainside, but yet these glimmers of civilization that lived. And so I used like gold leaf, and and the layers came back, right? I was printing mountains on top of mountains, colors on top of colors, and it created this, really beautiful thing. And I left it there for Pallavi. And I was like, well, this is the best that's going to happen because I have nothing else inside of me. And she loved it. And that's kind of where I saw myself. And at the time I was at a turning point in my career where I wanted to do art conservation. She had introduced me to art conservation. And so I was thinking about like, okay, like chemistry was great, but like I felt like lost in chemistry. Like I didn't find a purpose for it anymore in my life. And as the rest of the year went on, I took drawing because I met with a conservation grad student at NYU who I loved very dearly. Her name is Taylor. And I remember feeling, and she was like, and like we went over my plans, and she's like, well, you need to draw. And I was like, okay, we're drawing. Like if we're committing to this, we have to take this drawing class. And then I started pushing my art there. But I think at the time when I created those pieces about the mountains, I didn't know what I was doing, right? It's like a year later where I like recognized that these themes of my life propped up in these like random instances, and I had to address them, right? Because in drawing, I immediately reverted back to creating beautiful art, right? Just art that pleased the viewer, pleased my professor. And I started to push back on that kind of as my senior year came, and I took sculpture. Because, I reverted right back to, this idea of like, my art is only validated if the viewer thinks it's beautiful. And me having to really grapple and understand that, my art isn't always going to be beautiful, but like, what is even beauty, right? What is this aesthetic of beauty that I'm going for? Because it's European based, right? It's this idea of photorealism, photo perfection, great technique, which is all like important things you need as an artist, but not as substantive to my story, right? So like, which beauty standards am I trying to emulate, adhere to? And that's kind of like where it all started with these mountains that like came back to haunt me later. But, they always show up back again in my art. I think mountains are very beautiful landmarks in themselves. But I always think back to that time when I went when I was 18. And like, funny enough, like I think the world is so small, but one of the textiles that I worked on in my senior thesis came from the island of the Sun, which I visited when I was 18. Had no idea that this was ever going to come out up again in my life. And to be able to kind of, give these works of art, these stories, a location where they're coming from, and kind of like understanding the nature of who they are, where they live, I think it gives me a greater depth. And that's something that, like, when I moved away, I never understood. But I was able to kind of get a taste of it when I did travel part of Bolivia back when I was 18. And it has directly informed everything that I have done subsequently following, whether or not I wanted it to or intended it to. It kind of just crawled into my life and has stayed very permanently. Oh wow.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
we're good. Don't worry about it. I wanted to ask this one last question, and something that struck me so much about your last answer is these sort of like the concept of layers as a sort of like physical and like iconographic theme in your work, but also these layers sort of your grandfather's experience and your experience sort of mirroring one another, and these experiences sort of like that span time and place and sort of have differing scales that sort of match up when they meet in your work. And it reminds me a lot of something that you wrote in your artist statement that we read that I loved. And you said about your embroidered works, these three-dimensional woven fabric was a microcosmic visualization of our communities, animals, gods, goddesses, and place, which I feel like sort of ties in this like layered connections and differences in scale. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, just to bring everything together as our last question.
Yeah, differences in scale. I think it's funny, art works in the moment where, like, when you're creating things, you don't think about it. Like, you almost like just like feel this very instinctual need. I think scale, I always think of, like, my brain works in connecting things, right? And why things fall into specific things. And I think that the layers and the scales that I try to address are really indicative of me trying to understand my story, right? Because even among these layers, there's holes everywhere, right? And I talk a little bit about like the holes in like my indigeneity, and how like I have like myself participated in this like intergenerational violence of erasure and hatred towards myself, towards this color of my skin, because I was almost indoctrinated into thinking that I wasn't as beautiful as my cousins who were lighter, who were fairer and had lighter hair color. And so I think it's really ironic that like I talk about like these layers as if I figured them out, but I almost like have to peel every layer. Every time I have to open this back up, I peel it away, because everything works in tangent with each other. There's always intersecting lines, and I feel like on a daily basis I kind of contend with like, where are they intersecting, how big is the intersection, right? Like, my thesis was really difficult because I couldn't talk about it with my family. I didn't feel like they would understand what I was doing, and so that was a large scale. That was something that felt very small at Williams, but very large in my life. And both the place, right? Like, my cousins don't really like going to other places in Bolivia. They prefer to go to Miami, but I don't want to go to Miami. Like, I wanted to really experience Bolivia. And so the scale of place and location, right? These huge, like, they're mammoth. Like, I felt so small in those places, as a person. And I find it, I don't know if I'm answering it correctly, but like, talking about landscapes and this, like, these mountains, like structural things, like desert, different, like, also like altitude, right? Like, these mountains are in really, really high altitudes, and they're almost remote. Like, you would expect them to be remote. Like, nobody's supposed to live there, but yet people have still kind of pushed the boundaries of living there. And so, like, the scale of these civilizations and these cultures and these histories, but yeah, I found them in a little book in Sawyer, right? And so, like, how things, can be breath, like, grow and breathe into these enormous things that are people's entire lives and like centuries of history. And it could be boiled down and condensed into this like very small book, right? Stuck in a library somewhere, or like one textile piece that I created, or maybe like my story, but yet it's still just as relevant to the bigger thing. And so I'm constantly grappling with scale. Like I love art that's really large. So my textiles are about 9 feet tall. Like, so they're bigger than life. And I've always gravitated towards huge art because, well, like, I think I want the viewer to be consumed. Like, I want you to feel like your presence physically is very small compared to like what maybe I'm trying to address, right? Yeah, I have always loved large art. I think it's because I like to create an environment for the viewer and have them, like, you can't look away from it. It's too big for you to look away from. And one of my good friends in the art department, Sam, she was like, yeah, like some artists make big red things because people like can't seem to not look away from. And I laugh at that because I make big red things, but like my big red things are a little bit more like nuanced than just like a red, just something red. But yeah, this like idea where like I want the viewer to be captivated, right? I don't want them to look away. And even when they want to look away, they still have to contend with their voyeurism when they're looking at these objects. And so, yeah, I think scale, I never thought about like the scale of my things. I just always just like preferred larger things. But now I think that it's like more of an artistic, it's like I forgot the late name for it, but it's like almost like an inherent, no, it's like an unintentional artistic decision that has meaning, but you don't know the meaning like the moment that you do it. That's, I don't know the word for it, but
that
that's
sentiment
it.
feels very relevant to your growth as an artist. It feels like these sort of like symbols and meanings and important themes circled around your life frequently and came up in your work, and it was almost like in hindsight that you realized just how deep that significance was.
Oh, most definitely. Everything was in hindsight. I think now with the work I'm creating, I feel more present in it, right? I don't feel like a passive bystander that's just like these things are just like coming out of me and I like have no way other than to deal with them than to create something out of them. Now I feel like I'm much more intentional, and it comes from having that art history background. It comes from being able to look at things and spending, hours and hours and hours with these textiles and trying to understand them. Because quite honestly, when I started my thesis, I didn't like textiles, and I'll be the first one to say I didn't. And I had to contend with myself, I had to sit with myself and ask myself, well, why don't you like them, right? They're very beautiful objects. And it came down to the fact that I myself was so brainwashed that like these works were not worthy of anything more because they were indigenous due to my family's teachings, that I had to unlearn that all over again, right? And have like really difficult conversations with myself about whether or not I had perpetuated this violence. And I don't know if you guys got the copy, but I did send Pallavi, one of my artist statements is a letter to my grandmother, actually. And it's this like conversation, and I've been penning letters to her, although she doesn't read English, which is fine. She can't see very well either, which is really peculiar. But I've been penning these letters to try to understand my role in the violence, and my decision not to participate in it anymore as this almost like radical act of like rebellion against my family. And I mean, whether or not they'll ever understand what I'm trying to do, I hope that one day, like my niece won't grow up with the same thoughts that I've had, or maybe like, I hope that like, I'll be able to kind of redirect the energy in my family into something else. But it's like a daily struggle. It's like, why is it that my family doesn't respect me as much? I feel like they loved my art that was really photorealistic. And it harps right back to the fact that like we perpetuate our own violence, right? It's like, why do we want to be somebody else so badly? And so that's just like one of the things that like I now presently as an artist constantly grapple with. And it feels better to know what I'm doing now than like think about things 2 years later, because it helps me create more intentional works.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maria. I think unfortunately that has to be our last question, but we appreciate so much you sharing all of this with us. It's been incredible to hear more.
No, thank you so much for having me. No, I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you again, Maria. That was just beautiful and cathartic and amazing. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
No, thank you so much for having me. I miss you guys, and I hope.
You too.
Hopefully we can be back soon.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
That I'm working on will actually be in Sawyer in December-ish. So yeah.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
At the school. So it will be up and around. So you guys will be able to see it.
We'll have to do a second round interview once we can go see it.
Yeah, there's new things we're uncovering here on a daily basis. So no, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys.